The road stretched out like a dark ribbon before me, the only light coming from my truck's high beams slicing through the endless black. I've been a long-haul trucker for nearly a decade, and the silence of the road is something I've come to enjoy. There's a stillness in the night, a peacefulness, even as the hum of the engine vibrates through my bones. But tonight, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a heaviness clung to the air, a sense that something was waiting for me just beyond the reach of my lights. My shift started normally enough, picked up a load from Kansas, heading east through a stretch of remote highway with a delivery scheduled for the morning. The dispatcher told me this route was pretty desolate, but that's never bothered me before. The quieter, the better. I liked driving alone, leaving the rest of the world behind as I pushed through the long, empty miles. About an hour ago, I passed a small town, the kind you blink and miss. Its gas station was closed, just a dim light flickering above an old soda machine, giving it a sort of forgotten, haunted look. I remember checking the clock, 2:37 a.m. normally. By now, I'd have the radio on, maybe listening to some classic rock or a podcast to keep my mind occupied. But tonight, the radio was nothing but static, no matter how many stations I flipped through. Weird, but not impossible in the middle of nowhere. As I glanced at the rearview mirror, the strangest feeling hit me. You know that sensation when you're sure someone's watching you? Like an itch you can't scratch. I rubbed my neck and shook it off. No one's watching. It's just the empty highway, me and my rig. Nothing more. 15 minutes later, something caught my eye. The figure on the side of the road, just standing there. My heart skipped a beat. No one should be out here at this time, and definitely not on foot. My lights flashed over them too quickly to get a good look. But I swear, in that split second, I saw a woman, dressed in white, her face turned away from the road, standing perfectly still. She was gone as quickly as she appeared, swallowed up by the dark as I drove past. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching in protest as the truck skidded slightly. My heart was pounding, and my hand shook on the wheel. The hell was that? I checked the mirrors again, scanning the darkness behind me. Nothing. No one. My hand hovered over the door handle, but a strange dread settled in my gut. Every instinct I had screamed not to get out, so I didn't. Instead, I waited, the engine idling in the silence. Minutes passed, my eyes glued to the rearview. The longer I stared, the more ridiculous I felt. Maybe I just imagined her. It's late, I'm tired, and I've still got hours to go. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. I pressed my foot to the gas and continued down the highway, but the uneasy feeling followed me like a shadow. It wasn't long before the road started to feel like it was closing in on me. The trees lining the highway seemed to stretch taller, their branches bending and twisting in the wind. There was a tension in the air, like the road was alive, watching, waiting. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my brain. And that's when the radio turned on by itself. At first, it was just static, that low hum filling the cab. I reached to switch it off, thinking maybe I bumped the dial somehow. But as my hand moved closer, the static shifted. A voice, faint and garbled, broke through the noise. It wasn't a station. It was whispering. I snatched my hand back, my pulse quickening. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if someone or something was trying to speak to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening.
Urgent.
And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the radio fell silent again. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "Get it together," I muttered under my breath. But as I glanced into the rearview again, I felt my blood run cold. The woman was back. This time, she was closer, standing directly in the middle of the road behind me, illuminated in the glow of my taillights. She hadn't been there a second ago, but now, there she was, pale, her eyes dark voids, staring right at me. A violent shiver ran down my spine. Without thinking, I hit the gas, the truck lurching forward with a growl. I didn't look back, not once, as the speedometer climbed higher and higher. I needed to get out of here, get away from her. The highway twisted and turned, and the trees blurred past me as I sped into the night. But no matter how fast I drove, that eerie sensation, that feeling that I was being followed, clung to me like a second skin. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was I hallucinating? Was I just too tired to be driving? Or was there something else out there? Something that had found me in the dark and wasn't going to let me go? After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights ahead, a rest stop, glowing like a beacon in the night. I pulled in, my tires screeching as I parked the rig under one of the dim street lamps. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The rest stop was small, just a couple of vending machines and a dingy bathroom. There were a few other trucks parked nearby, their drivers presumably asleep in their cabs. But something didn't feel right about this place either. It was too quiet, too still. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence, the weight of the night pressing down on me. The woman's face, those empty eyes, flashed in my mind again. I shook my head, trying to clear the image. I needed a break. Maybe some air would help clear my head. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, the wind biting at my skin. The highway stretched out before me, empty and silent. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, a new sound reached my ears. Whistling, soft at first, almost playful, like a tune someone might hum absent-mindedly. But it was getting louder, closer. I turned toward the sound, my heart thudding in my chest. There, standing at the edge of the rest stop, barely visible in the shadows, was the woman. She was watching me, and she was smiling. The cold wind whipped through the rest stop, rustling the leaves on the nearby trees. My breath hung in the air like a cloud, and my heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the figure in the shadows. The woman, the same one I had seen on the road, was still there, her pale face turned towards me, her smile chilling, unnatural. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my legs rooted to the spot. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The sound of whistling filled the air, slow and haunting. A tune that felt too familiar, as though I'd heard it somewhere before, though I couldn't remember when or where. Then she moved. It was subtle at first, just a slow, deliberate shift in her posture. But as her feet carried her forward, I saw something was off. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, as if she was being pulled by invisible strings. Her legs didn't bend right. Her arms hung limp at her sides. The closer she got, the more I realized something even more horrifying. Her eyes, those black voids, were fixed directly on me. I could feel my pulse racing in my neck. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to get back in the truck, lock the doors, and drive as far away as possible. But my feet refused to obey. It was as though the air itself had thickened around me, holding me in place, forcing me to confront whatever she was. She stopped about 20 feet away, just outside the pool of light from the rest stop's flickering lamp. Her smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. The whistling stopped. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you want?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, just kept smiling, her lips stretched unnaturally wide. And then, without warning, she vanished. Not in a way that she turned and walked away. She simply blinked out of existence, as if she had never been there at all. My heart nearly stopped in my chest as I stumbled backward, my back slamming into the side of my truck. I gasped for breath, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I wasn't imagining this. This wasn't a trick of my exhausted brain. Something was very, very wrong. I yanked the truck door open, clambering inside as fast as my shaky hands would allow. Once inside, I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. The cab felt safe, confined. But as I sat there, my hands still on the steering wheel, staring out into the empty rest stop, a new fear gripped me. Was she inside? I spun around, scanning the back of the truck where my bed was, the shadows in the corners seeming to shift. The small space was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I reached for the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The narrow space remained unchanged. Nothing there. I was alone, but something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. The truck was cold, but my skin was damp with sweat. My heart was still hammering in my chest, the adrenaline refusing to leave my veins. I had to get out of here. I had to get back on the road. Fumbling with the keys, I jammed them into the ignition, and the truck roared to life. The headlights flooded the parking lot, and for a brief moment, I scanned the area again. Nothing, just the other parked trucks and the small, dingy rest stop building. No woman, no one. As I pulled back onto the highway, I told myself that was it. Maybe I'd finally lost it, seen something that wasn't really there, a hallucination from lack of sleep. Maybe I'd been on the road too long, the monotony of the drive messing with my head. The rational part of me tried to explain it away, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something wasn't right. Something had found me. For the next few miles, I tried to push the encounter from my mind, focusing on the road ahead. But the farther I drove, the more the fear gnawed at me. The highway was still eerily empty, the black stretch of asphalt stretching out in front of me like an endless void. The trees on either side of the road seemed to lean in closer, their branches clawing at the edges of my vision. Then the lights in the cab flickered, just a quick flash like a power surge. I glanced up, my stomach tightening. The radio crackled to life again, that same low static filling the air. I tried to ignore it, gripping the wheel tighter, willing myself to focus. But the static grew louder, and through it, I heard the voice again. This time it was clearer. A woman's voice, soft, almost melodic, whispering something just out of reach. I turned the volume knob, trying to shut it off, but the static remained. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if she was right there in the cab with me. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. My heart stopped. My body went rigid, every muscle tensing as the cold air brushed against my skin again, sending a wave of ice through my veins. I didn't dare look in the mirror. Couldn't. Every instinct told me not to, but that cold breath, it was too real. I wasn't alone. The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the cab was dead silent. Then, slowly, the radio dial began to turn on its own. The static shifted, and through it I heard something else. A song. A soft, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. It was the same tune the woman had been whistling back at the rest stop. That slow, unsettling melody that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat of the cab, her face barely visible in the darkness, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She was smiling at me, that same unnatural grin, her black eyes wide and unblinking. Her hands rested in her lap, but there was something wrong with them. They looked twisted, mangled, like they had been broken and reformed. My blood ran cold as her eyes met mine in the mirror. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural sound that sent a wave of nausea through me. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't just sit there with her behind me. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the brake. The truck lurched violently, the tires screeching as the massive vehicle came to a shuddering halt in the middle of the highway. I was thrown forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest, but I didn't care. My heart pounded in my throat as I turned around, fully expecting her to be right there, reaching for me. But the back seat was empty. I stared at the empty space for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She was gone. Again. My hands trembled as I slowly turned back to face the road, the headlights casting long shadows across the empty highway. I couldn't stay here. I needed to keep moving. But as I reached for the gear shift, something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, just a few feet in front of the truck. The woman. She was back, standing motionless in the beam of the headlights, her dark eyes staring directly at me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. Every instinct told me to drive, to get out of there. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in her gaze. Slowly, She began to walk towards the truck. I slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed up, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But she didn't stop. She kept coming, her pace slow and deliberate, that eerie smile never leaving her face. I pressed harder on the gas, the truck jerking as I tried to turn it around. But before I could make my escape, something hit the windshield. A hand. Her hand, pressed flat against the glass, her fingers splayed wide. Her face was right there, just inches from mine, separated only by the thin layer of glass. Her eyes bore into me, her mouth still twisted into that horrible grin. The truck stalled. I was trapped. I slammed the key into the ignition and twisted, but the engine only coughed in protest. The woman's hand stayed pressed against the windshield. Her fingers splayed wide, leaving faint smudges on the glass. Her face hovered just inches from mine, that terrifying smile still etched onto her pale features. She began tapping on the glass, her nails making a soft click, click, click sound, as if she were taunting me, waiting for me to break. The engine sputtered again, refusing to come to life. My heart raced, and the world around me shrank to just her. Her face, her eyes, her smile. I slammed my fist against the dashboard in frustration, trying to think, trying to figure out how to get out of this. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay trapped in this truck with her outside, or worse, inside. The thought of her slipping in through the door or appearing behind me again made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, forcing my trembling hands to steady. I had to think, focus. The headlights still cut through the darkness, illuminating the woman as she slowly dragged her hand down the windshield, leaving a streak. Her eyes never left mine. I shifted in my seat, my hand reaching for the gear lever. Maybe if I could just push the truck into neutral, I could coast backward, far enough to get away from her, far enough to buy myself some time. But as my hand closed around the lever, she spoke. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. I froze. The words sent a chill through my spine, but it was more than just fear. There was something in the way she said it, as though she wasn't angry, as though she were lonely. Her face pressed closer to the glass, her lips barely moving as she repeated, "Don't go." It was then that I noticed something strange, something that made my heart skip a beat. Her reflection in the glass. There was none. No hint of her in the mirror, no shadow of her figure in the light. Just her cold, empty face in front of me. The realization shook me to my core. Whatever she was, she wasn't human. I needed to get out of here now. My fingers fumbled with the gear lever, my hands slick with sweat. The moment I shifted into neutral, the truck began to roll backward, the tires crunching over the gravel of the road. I didn't dare take my eyes off her. She didn't move, just stood there, watching, her hands still trailing down the windshield. The truck rolled back farther, gaining speed as it went downhill. I gripped the steering wheel, my entire body trembling as I kept my eyes locked on her. But just as I thought I was putting some distance between us, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone. Not faded, not stepped away, just gone, like a flicker of a dying candle flame. I slammed on the brakes, the truck lurching to a stop. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the adrenaline surging through me. The windshield was clear now, no smudge marks, no handprints, as if she had never been there at all. But I knew she had been. I could still feel her presence, like a cold shadow lingering over my shoulder. I glanced around, checking the mirrors, scanning the road behind me, the trees, everything. Nothing. I was alone again, or at least it looked that way. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment to gather myself. The engine was dead, the cab silent save for the faint ticking of the cooling metal. The darkness outside seemed to close in on the truck, the highway stretching out into the void, empty and unwelcoming. Just as I was about to try the ignition again, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of movement behind me. My entire body went cold, my skin prickling with fear. It was subtle, just a shift in the air, like someone had disturbed the small space behind the driver's seat. My pulse quickened as I sat there, paralyzed, unable to turn around, unable to face whatever it was that I knew was there. The silence in the truck grew oppressive, the tension thickening until it felt like I couldn't breathe. I had to look. I had to know. Slowly, inch by inch, I began to turn my head, my eyes sliding toward the back of the cab. At first, I didn't see anything, just the bed, the blanket slightly askew from when I had checked it earlier. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, curled in the corner of the small space. It was hunched over, its form indistinct, but I could feel its gaze on me, watching, waiting for me to make a move. My breath caught in my throat, and my body went rigid, every nerve on high alert. The shadow shifted slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something pale within the darkness. A face. Her face. She was inside the cab. I stifled a scream, my mind scrambling for a plan. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was as if the very air had thickened, making every breath a struggle. I watched as the shadow slithered forward, her body still partially hidden in the gloom, but her face, twisted in that unnatural grin, was visible now, her black, soulless eyes locked on mine. And then she whispered again, "Stay with me." Her voice was closer this time, more intimate, as if she were speaking directly into my ear. The cold breath I had felt before returned, brushing against my skin like a ghostly caress. My body tensed, every muscle frozen, as I fought the primal urge to flee, to tear open the door and leap into the night. But there was no escaping her. She was already here, inside my truck, inside my mind. "Please," she whispered again, and this time, I felt her cold fingers brush against the back of my neck. My heart nearly stopped. I jerked forward, slamming my knee into the dashboard as I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape. The pain shot through my leg, but I barely felt it. My entire body was consumed with the need to get out, to get as far away from her as possible. My hand fumbled for the handle, but just as I was about to pull it open, the door locked with a loud click. "No," I breathed, tugging at the handle, my movements frantic. I yanked harder, but the lock wouldn't budge. It was as though the truck itself had trapped me inside. A soft laugh echoed from behind me, cold and mocking. The sound was wrong, distorted, like it was being played backward. I could hear her moving now, the soft scrape of her body dragging across the floor of the cab, getting closer. My chest tightened as panic surged through me, my hands shaking as I pounded on the door, praying for it to open. But it wouldn't. "Stay!" Her voice was right next to my ear now. I could feel her breath on my skin, cold and damp, sending waves of nausea through me. My vision blurred, my body reacting on instinct, and without thinking, I reached for the ignition again, praying the truck would start this time. The key turned, and for a split second, the engine coughed to life, a glimmer of hope sparking in my chest. But before I could shift into gear, the truck stalled again, the engine dying with a sickening whine. Suddenly, the cold grip of her hand wrapped around my wrist, and I screamed. Her touch was icy, and as her fingers tightened, I could feel the life being drained from me. It was as if her presence was pulling me into the same void that existed in her eyes. A darkness so deep and empty, there was no escape. I whipped around, jerking my arm free, finally forcing myself to look at her. She was crouched just behind the driver's seat, her body twisted and unnatural, her head cocked at an impossible angle. Her eyes were wide and staring, her mouth pulled back in that grotesque grin. But there was something else now, something far worse. Her smile had stretched, far too wide for any human mouth. The corners of her lips split, dark blood staining her teeth. And from the gaping maw, a low, guttural moan began to rise, vibrating through the air and filling the cab with a horrible, vibrating sound. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out. I had to get out now. Without thinking, I kicked at the door, throwing my weight against it again and again. The force of each impact rattled through the truck, but the door wouldn't give. The cold air in the cab seemed to thicken, becoming oppressive, suffocating. Her moan grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel her crawling closer. Her hand reached out, cold fingers stretching toward my face. In a last-ditch effort, I slammed my fist into the dashboard, hitting the emergency power switch. The truck's lights flickered once, then roared back to life, flooding the cab with a harsh, blinding light. The sudden burst of brightness stunned me for a moment, but it was enough. In the mirror, I saw her face twist in agony, her eyes narrowing to slits as the light burned through her. She let out a scream, her voice high-pitched and unnatural, like metal grinding against metal. For a moment, her form seemed to shimmer, her body distorting in the glow of the lights. And then, just like before, she vanished. I gasped for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The cab was empty again, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. My heart thundered in my chest, the echoes of her screams still ringing in my ears. I didn't waste any time. I threw the truck into gear, the engine roaring back to life as I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as I shot forward, the highway stretching out before me once more. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. But even as the miles flew past, my pulse racing with every turn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she was still with me, hiding in the shadows just out of sight, waiting for the next moment to strike. For a long time, the road remained empty. I kept the truck barreling down the highway, refusing to let my guard down, refusing to slow. My hands gripped the wheel so tight I thought they might break, and every time I checked the mirrors, I expected to see her face staring back at me. But she was gone, at least for now. Hours passed, though I couldn't be sure exactly how long. The highway remained deserted, the endless stretch of asphalt winding through the darkness, the trees on either side casting long, skeletal shadows. I couldn't shake the tension in my chest, the feeling that something was still wrong. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. My hands trembled as I stared at the silhouette in the distance. It was hard to make out in the low light, but it was unmistakable. A person standing perfectly still, facing away from the road. A wave of dread washed over me. Couldn't be her. Not again. I squinted, trying to get a better look. There was something off about the figure. Too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. As I watched, it began to move, slowly turning toward the truck. And then I saw its face. It wasn't her. It wasn't human. The thing on the side of the road had no eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its head tilted to the side, as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. And then it began to walk toward me. The figure moved toward the truck with slow, deliberate steps, its long limbs swinging unnaturally at its sides. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it approach, that smooth, featureless face aimed directly at me. It didn't make a sound, didn't hesitate. It simply came closer, as if it had all the time in the world, and nowhere else to be but here with me. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires spinning and screeching as I tried to put some distance between myself and whatever was out there. The truck lurched backward, but it wasn't fast enough. I could still see the figure, that tall, unnatural shape closing the gap between us. My heart raced, and my mind scrambled for a plan. Any plan. This stretch of highway was empty, no other vehicles, no help for miles. There was nowhere to go. The only option was to escape, to get as far away from this thing as I could. But as the figure came closer, I realized I was out of time. It stopped just a few feet from the truck, standing directly in the center of the road. I stared in horror, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. It was tall, too tall, its head nearly brushing the tops of the trees on either side of the highway. And though its face was featureless, I could feel it watching me. A pressure in the air, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. For a moment, I thought about flooring it, plowing through the thing and hoping it would just dissolve into the night. But something deep in my gut told me that wouldn't work. I'd seen enough tonight to know that this thing, whatever it was, didn't follow the rules of the world I knew. It was something else, something wrong. The figure cocked its head, as if listening. Then it moved. Not toward me, but to the side of the truck, its long legs carrying it out of the beam of the headlights. My pulse quickened as I lost sight of it in the darkness. Where was it going? What was it planning? My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced around, scanning the mirrors, hoping, praying, that it had disappeared. But then, to my horror, I saw it. The figure was standing beside the passenger door, its face, or where its face should have been, pressed against the glass. I screamed, the sound escaping my throat in a broken, terrified sob. The thing's skin was stretched tight across its skull, too smooth, too perfect. And though it had no eyes, I could feel it staring right through me, right into me. I threw the truck into gear, my hands shaking violently as I slammed my foot onto the gas. The truck roared to life, the tires spinning against the asphalt as I shot forward, desperate to get away. The figure vanished from the side of the truck, lost in the blur of speed as I barreled down the highway. But even as I sped away, I knew it wasn't over. The feeling, that oppressive, crushing weight, still lingered. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't left. It was still out there, watching, waiting for me to stop. My foot stayed glued to the gas pedal, the truck's engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. The highway stretched out in front of me, an endless, dark tunnel with no end in sight. The trees on either side loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting in the wind, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road. But I wasn't safe. I could feel it. The truck lurched, shuddering violently, as if something had grabbed hold of it from behind. My heart leaped into my throat, and I glanced into the rearview mirror. The figure was running behind me. It moved impossibly fast, its long, spindly limbs propelling it forward, its smooth, featureless face locked onto me. My stomach twisted in terror as I watched it close the gap between us, its unnatural form growing larger in the mirror with each passing second. I slammed my foot down harder on the gas, but the truck was already at its limit. The engine whined in protest, the speedometer needle shaking as it hovered dangerously close to the red zone. I couldn't outrun it. I had to do something. Then, just as the figure was about to reach the back of the truck, the dashboard lights flickered, and the radio crackled to life once again. The static filled the cab, that low, unsettling hum vibrating through the air. My pulse quickened as I braced myself, knowing what was coming next. The whistling, that same haunting tune, the one I'd heard back at the rest stop, the one that had followed me all night, filled the cab. It was slow, melodic, but there was something different about it now. It felt closer, more insistent, like it was inside my head, inside my skin. And then, through the static, I heard her voice again. "Don't go," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the radio. "You belong here with us." I gripped the steering wheel, my hands slick with sweat, my body trembling with fear. I knew what was happening. She wasn't just watching me. She wasn't just following me. She was calling me, drawing me into something I couldn't understand, something far worse than death. The truck shuddered again, and this time I felt it. The figure had caught up. There was a sudden, violent thump from the roof, as if something heavy had landed on top of the cab. My heart nearly stopped, my mind racing as I realized what it was. It was on the truck. The metal creaked under the weight of the thing as it crawled across the roof, its limbs scraping against the steel, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep the truck steady as I sped down the highway, but the noise, the pressure, was unbearable. The whistling grew louder, more urgent, filling the cab until it drowned out everything else. My head throbbed with the sound, my vision blurring as the oppressive weight of it all pressed down on me. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then the roof buckled. The metal groaned and warped as the thing pressed down, its hands, or whatever they were, gripping the edges of the cab. I could hear it moving, feel its weight shifting as it tried to get in. I had to stop it. Without thinking, I swerved hard to the left, the truck careening toward the shoulder of the road. The tires screeched, the whole vehicle lurching violently as I tried to shake the thing loose. The truck swerved again, the weight on the roof shifting, and for a split second, I thought it might work. But then the windshield cracked. I screamed as a long, spindly arm punched through the glass, jagged shards raining down on me. The arm was long, too long, its fingers stretching toward me, reaching for my face. I swerved again, trying to shake it off, but the arm twisted, latching onto the steering wheel, pulling it to the side. The truck veered sharply to the right, the tires screaming as I fought to keep control. But it was too late. The thing was inside now, its hand gripping the wheel, its body slithering through the broken windshield. And then I saw it, her face. The woman's face, twisted and broken, staring at me from the passenger seat. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice filled with cold, empty hunger. "It's time to come home." The truck hit something, a rock or a ditch, and the world flipped. The cab spun, metal screaming as the truck rolled, glass shattering and darkness consuming everything. My body was thrown against the seat, my head slamming into the side window as the truck tumbled down the embankment. For a moment, everything was black, silent. Then, slowly, I became aware of the pain, sharp, blinding pain in my leg, my chest, my head. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand where I was. The truck was on its side, the cab crushed in, glass and metal scattered all around me. I groaned, reaching for the door, my hands slick with blood. I pulled myself up, gasping as the pain shot through my body. My leg was twisted at a strange angle, and my head throbbed with every heartbeat. But I was alive. I crawled out of the truck, dragging myself through the broken window, my hands trembling as I pulled myself onto the dirt road. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, and the sound of dripping fluid echoed through the night. But it wasn't over. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I heard it again. The whistling, slow, deliberate, echoing through the darkness. I lifted my head, my vision swimming, and saw them. The woman and the figure, standing side by side on the road, watching me. Their faces were smooth, empty, featureless, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unyielding. The woman smiled, her lips parting as she whispered, "You can't escape." And then they moved, slowly, deliberately, walking toward me. I tried to scream, tried to crawl away, but my body wouldn't respond. The pain was too much, the fear too overwhelming. They were getting closer, their forms looming over me, blocking out the stars. I was trapped. There was no escape. As they stood over me, their shadows swallowing me whole, I realized the truth. There was no road, no destination. This was where it ended. This was where it had always ended. The whistling grew louder, filling the air, filling my head, as their cold hands reached down toward me, and everything went black.